I'd like to talk about Al-Farabi's contribution to the development of traditional logic. Al-Farabi is an Islamic philosopher and logician who was active in the late 9th century and early 20th century. So traditional logic, as we call it, was originating from Aristotle's works in the Organon. And the modern logic is contrasted with the traditional logic, and modern logic has been developed in the late 19th century. And the traditional logic and the modern logic is supposed to be significantly different in one respect about the so-called existential import of categorical propositions. And here, the traditional logic has a doctrine about existential import of categorical propositions that I will call the affirmative negative doctrine. And Al-Farabi made a significant contribution to the development of this doctrine, which I will be talking about. So I will begin with an introduction, and I will say what the affirmative negative doctrine is. And then as an introduction, I will say something about Al-Farabi's discussion of categorical propositions in the syllogism. And then I will move on to Al-Farabi's discussion of existential import in a treatise called Al Maqūlāt. And then I will have a bit of discussion, if I have time, about issues that lies beyond Al Maqūlāt, and then I will end up with a summary. And so here is an introduction. So Al-Farabi wrote commentaries on lots of Aristotle's works, including his works in logic. And one of the commentaries called Kitāb al Maqūlāt, which is a commentary on Aristotle's categories, is the one that I'll be talking about. While I'll be talking about the discussion in Kitāb al Maqūlāt, I will use some of the passages in his syllogism, his commentary on prior analytics as a background. So here, I will now say what I meant by categorical import. So existential import. So, well, in traditional logic, categorical propositions are distinguished into different kinds. One, singular categoricals, such as J is white and J is not white. And then general categoricals. Among the general categoricals, there are indefinite or undetermined categoricals, such as humans are white, humans are not white, while they don't have quantifiers. On the other hand, if they have quantifiers, well, they can be called determined categorical propositions. There are 4 kinds of them. And then what about the existential import? Well, this relates to the so-called existence of the subjects. Or another way of putting it is that we can make existential propositions matching the categorical propositions, in particular, matching the subject term of the existential categorical propositions. For example, when you have J is white, J is not white, we can consider the existential proposition J exists. And then when we have categorical propositions involving a general term as the subject term, such as a human, we can have a general existential proposition such as there is a human. Now, the question is how the categorical propositions relate to the existential propositions and matching them. So here, well, now and then we get different kind of existential import theses. Before I formulate some of the existential import theses, let me go back to talk about the 4 kinds of determined general categorical propositions. There are 4 kinds of them: universal affirmative, A, and universal negative, E, and then particular affirmatives, I, and then particular negatives, O. So representative examples of the 4 kinds are every human is white, no human is white, some human is white, some human is not white. Now, existential hypothesis. For example, some might hold, and Al-Fārābī holds, that jade is white implies jade exists. We can call this one singular existential hypothesis. So singular proposition, affirmative singular proposition has existential import. About A propositions, namely universal affirmative propositions, such as every human is white, and you might hold that such propositions imply they are matching existential propositions. For example, every human is white implies there is a human. This thesis is called AEI thesis. Another example, or existential hypothesis. So universal particular negatives, such as some human is not white, and if you hold that such propositions imply they are matching existential propositions, such as there is a human, you are holding an OEI thesis. But it turns out that Al-Fārābī holds AEI thesis, but denies OEI thesis. Now, let me see. Well, actually, Al-Fārābī does not discuss existential import issues in this way. Instead of talking about whether or not some categorical propositions, some kinds of categorical propositions have existential import, he rather considers what happens when categorical propositions have subject terms that are empty. So those are categorical propositions that I call empty subject categoricals. So to say what such categoricals are, we need to talk about empty terms, because there are two kinds of terms in question here, singular terms such as Pegasus and the general terms such as chimera. We need to distinguish two kinds of empty terms. One, singular empty terms such as Pegasus. Pegasus is a singular empty term because it doesn't denote anything. In other words, Pegasus does not exist. Well, a general term such as a chimera is an empty term, empty general term, because chimera, again, does not denote anything, namely, there is no chimera. And so if you use Pegasus or chimera as subject terms of categorical propositions, you have categoricals with empty subject terms, or in the traditional terminology, categoricals with non-existent subjects. Okay. Well, Al-Fārābī considers what the truth values of empty subject categoricals. And so for that reason, Al-Fārābī propounds several vacuous truth theses. So for example, Al-Fārābī says jade does not exist, implies jade is not white. So this is a vacuous truth thesis. So that is to say that jade is not white is vacuously true if jade does not exist. Namely, its subject does not exist. Okay, and so, well, this thesis is equivalent to one of the existential hypotheses, namely, jade is white implies jade exists. Okay, this is a singular existential hypothesis. Or, for example, Al-Fārābī holds what I call OVT thesis. There is no human implies some human is not white. Or alternatively, not every human is white. So Al-Fārābī's way of putting it is that the latter sentence, not every human is white, is vacuously true if the subject does not exist, namely, if there is no human. And this thesis is essentially logically equivalent to an existential import thesis, namely, every human is white. The universal affirmative proposition implies the matching existential proposition, namely, there is a human. Okay, so Al Maqūlāt discusses the truth values of empty subject categorical propositions. And so this, that discussion can be translated, as I explained. This is about existential import of categorical propositions. And so, well, the traditional objection, the usual objection made by the modern logicians is that traditional logic has difficulties in dealing with existential import of categorical propositions, but there is a but some scholars of traditional logic are now giving a response to this. That is that the traditional logicians have actually developed a fruitful doctrine of existential import. And one of the examples of such doctrines is the affirmative negative doctrine, as I will explain it. And then I think Al-Fārābī is made an important contribution to the development of this doctrine. So what is then the affirmative negative doctrine? Well, the affirmative negative doctrine distinguishes all categoricals into two kinds: affirmative categoricals and negative categoricals. Once you draw the distinction, then affirmative categoricals do have existential import on this doctrine, and the negative doctrines do not. And also negative doctrines can be vacuously true. So that's the idea. Well, specifically, then what kinds of propositions are affirmative and what kinds are negative? Well, here roughly it goes like this. So, well, before I go into this, so among the propositions that are commonly called particular negatives, it is useful to distinguish two different kinds. One is propositions of the form some A is not B, such as some man is not white. Another kind is propositions of the form not every A is B. And so, for example, not every human is white. So I call the first kind of propositions, such as some man is not white, all propositions. And then the second kind, such as not every man is white, I call it tilde A propositions, because they are negations of universal affirmative propositions. With this in mind, so let us see what kind of propositions are considered affirmative and negatives by those who hold the affirmative and negative doctrine. Well, among the things, so for example, Socrates is white, a singular proposition is affirmative. Humans are white, a general undetermined propositions is also affirmative. And then universal affirmative and the particular affirmative propositions are affirmative propositions. By contrast, negative propositions include Socrates is not white, and humans are not white, and also universal negative propositions, and also the tilde A propositions. How about the all propositions, such as some man is not white? Well, about this, well, there is not a unanimous agreement. Okay, so I will get back to it later. Okay, and then in any case, once you have a classification of all categorical propositions into affirmatives and negatives, well, the affirmative negative doctrine holds that all affirmative categoricals have existential import, and then About the negative categoricals, actually the doctrine has two related theses. One, negative categoricals do not have existential import, and also negative categoricals are vacuously true if their subject terms are empty, or in other words, their subjects do not exist. Now, who held this doctrine? Well, this doctrine is considered the traditional view, is said to be the traditional view by Charles Peirce, and the Buridan held it, Ockham held it, and as we will see, Al-Fārābī held an early version of this doctrine. Well, how about Aristotle? Did Aristotle himself hold this doctrine, or can we attribute this doctrine to Aristotle? Well, some prominent scholars, Aristotle's logic, say the answer is yes. But I have doubts about it, and I think there is a good reason to hold that Aristotle does not hold this doctrine. And so if we combine these two pieces, namely that we cannot attribute the affirmative negative doctrine to Aristotle, and while we can attribute the doctrine to Al-Fārābī, then I think we get close to the view that Al-Fārābī might be the originator of the doctrine, unless there is someone in between who held this doctrine. But if there is anyone who did that, I don't know who it is. Okay. So here is a background so some bits in Al-Fārābī's discussions in his syllogism. And so like earlier philosophers, Al-Fārābī distinguished earlier Arabic philosophers, Al-Fārābī distinguishes four quantifiers: universal affirmative, every, and then no as universal negative, some as a particular affirmative, and not every as one single quantifier, particular negative quantifier. And then given that there are four quantifiers, you can get four kinds of determined categorical propositions, well, in terms of the quantifiers that they have. So there are universal affirmatives which has every, particular affirmatives which has some, and then universal negatives which has no, and the particular negatives which is not every. Well, so with this distinction, so Al-Fārābī distinguishes determined propositions into universal and the particular propositions, and then affirmative and negative propositions. But also, in order to talk about the truth or falsity, the truth conditions of categorical propositions, determine the categorical propositions, Al-Fārābī considers the subject and the predicate terms in them. And then, given the semantic relations between the subject and the predicate terms, he distinguishes categorical propositions into three kinds: categorical propositions with a necessary matter, and he calls, and then categorical propositions with impossible matter, categorical propositions with contingent matter, as he calls them. So examples of categoricals with necessary matter are those involving human as the subject and animal as the subject. And then those with impossible matter, an example of those categorical with impossible matter is every human is a stone, for example, or some human is a stone. And well, if you have human and white as a subject and predicate, you have categoricals with the contingent matter. So what kind of matters are called the necessary, impossible, and the contingent? Here, the idea is that, well, look at the example of human and animals. So all the animals which relate to the predicate term include all the humans which relate to the subject term. So in such cases, you have necessary matter, the categorical proposition in question. And then if the categorical proposition has a human and the stone as a subject in the predicate terms, well, look, all the stones include none of the humans. And so in such cases, the categorical propositions have impossible matter. And how about the contingent matters? Well, here an example is human and white. So if you take all the white things which relate to the predicate, then they include some of the humans, but not all of them. So in that case, you have contingent matter. Well, so once you have distinguished all the categoricals on the basis of the three kinds of matters in them, this is what you can get. So there are four kinds of categorical propositions. They might have necessary, impossible, or contingent matters, but once they have, for example, necessary matter, the truth values are determined. So categoricals with necessary matters are true only when they are affirmatives. So how about categoricals with impossible matter? Well, they can be true only when they are negative categoricals. How about categoricals with a contingent matter? Well, in that case, you have to be particular propositions. Some A is B, or not every A is B to be true. Okay, so apparently, so this doctrine, so the doctrine that is encapsulated in this table is an example of the modest, what I call the modest traditional doctrine of categoricals. This is the doctrine presented in Aristotle's De Interpretatione, well, in a theory called the theory of opposition. The doctrine here can be encapsulated by three theses. One, so the thesis that particular affirmatives do not imply matching universal affirmatives. And then the second one is the famous thesis called the subalternation. So universal affirmatives imply matching particular affirmatives. So for example, every human is white implies some human is white. So this is the thesis characteristic of traditional logic. And this is the thesis that distinguishes all systems of traditional logic from modern systems of logic. The third thesis is EI contradiction thesis, namely universal negatives and matching particular affirmatives are contradictory. And we can draw a diagram for a square diagram for this doctrine, namely the moderate traditional doctrine. So the square looks like this. And so, so this is like the famous square of opposition diagram drawn by Boethius. It differs, so if you replace not every A is B on the lower right corner with some A is not B, then you get Boethius square. Okay. Well, so what is the difference between the doctrine encapsulated in the Boethius diagram and then this variant? Well, that concerns the status of all propositions, namely propositions such as propositions of the form some A is not B. And here in this case, well, if you add the thesis, on top of the three theses mentioned here, if you add another thesis, universal affirmatives and matching all propositions are contradictory, then you get the doctrine encapsulated by Boethius' diagram. And that's the doctrine that I call the orthodox traditional doctrine, in contrast to the modest traditional doctrine. Okay. Well, this is an overview. And now, so here is a question that is arising. So all the methods of categoricals in the syllogism has been distinguished into three kinds: necessary, impossible, and contingent. But does this exhaust all the possibilities of the material relations between subject and the predicates of categorical propositions? And one plausible answer is that that's not like it. Okay, there is one important class of cases that are ignored, namely the empty subject categoricals, categoricals with empty subject terms, such as a chimera, man who is a donkey, then round, square, and so on. Those are categoricals whose subjects do not exist. And then what Al-Fārābī does in Al Maqūlāt is to discuss the truth values or the truth conditions of such categorical propositions. So we are now moving on to Al Maqūlāt. And Al Maqūlāt, so Kitāb al Maqūlāt, and so the discussion that I'll be giving now is something that I learned from Chetty and Hodges. And so here, the upshot is that the upshot can be can be added as a column, as the last column in this table. So empty term categoricals can be true only when the categoricals in question are negative propositions. And also that is to say, categoricals, affirmative categoricals are false when they have empty subject terms. And so that's that. And as you can see, well, the truth value assignment for empty subject categoricals is the same as the truth value of categoricals with impossible subjects, impossible matter. Well, what is the point of this? Previously, previously I said that, well, the doctrine of categoricals we have seen in Al-Fārābī's syllogism matches the doctrine of categoricals in Aristotle's De Interpretatione, and so it is encapsulated in three theses. And what Al-Fārābī has done is, in effect, to extend the modest transitional doctrine to cover empty subject categoricals. So the same doctrine applies to empty subject categoricals as well. That was the point. And so the upshot, and then by considering empty subject categoricals, and then in effect, Al-Fārābī has propounded existential hypothesis for the four kinds of categorical propositions. First, the affirmative propositions, whether they are universal or particular, have existential import. Negative propositions, whether they are universal or particular negatives, specifically bar A propositions, well, when they have empty subject terms, they are vacuously true. So that's the view, and so you can get this doctrine by simply entering what I call the IEI thesis. Particular affirmatives have existential import to the modest traditional doctrine, on top of the thesis that there are empty terms. Well, and then you can draw a diagram for this view, and that view is resulting from adding basically the thesis that sum A is B has existential import to the earlier square diagram for the moderate traditional the square diagram for the moderate traditional doctrine. And I call this doctrine Al-Farabi's doctrine. Well, so Al-Farabi's doctrine confirms with the affirmative negative doctrine. The question is, one question you might raise is whether Al-Farabi gives a general formulation of the affirmative negative doctrine. Well, the answer is no, as far as I can tell. Al-Farabi gives individual cases of affirmative categoricals, and then Al-Farabi have discussions of existential import of individual cases of negative categoricals, but he doesn't give a general formulation of the affirmative negative doctrine. But Al-Farabi's successor, an important successor, Avicenna, gives an early formulation of the affirmative negative doctrine. Namely, he gives a version of the affirmative thesis and then a version of the negative thesis that are constituting the affirmative negative doctrine, and which is given in his commentary on De Interpretatione, as translated by Hodges. Well, so that's all I want to say about Al Maqūlāt per se. And then there are some remaining questions that lie beyond, some remaining issues that lie beyond Al Maqūlāt's treatment. So one question is the status of particular negatives. Particular negatives, specifically all propositions such as some human is not white, and which are different from tilde A propositions such as not every human is white. And then the question is, does Al-Farabi thinks all propositions are affirmative or negative? Does he think that all propositions have existential import or not? This is one question. And then another issue is about the thesis about the logical thesis. Al-Farabi, like Aristotle, accepts the contraposition thesis. The contraposition thesis holds that every human is an animal, for example, is logically equivalent with every non-animal is a non-human. And so while now, about the first question, so I will be brief about it, and then for the sake of time, so I will leave the details for a later discussion. And here, about the particular negatives, actually two alternatives have been developed. On one view, well, which Ockham and Buridan held, well, all propositions should be considered negative propositions. I call this doctrine Ockham's doctrine. And then there is an alternative view that all propositions have existential import, and which means that they should be considered affirmative propositions, actually. And Abelard held this view. And so if you add this view to Al-Farabi's view, you get the doctrine that I call Abelard's doctrine. But Al Maqūlāt itself is neutral between Ockham's doctrine and Abelard's doctrine, in fact, giving simply a common core of the two doctrines while being silent about the status of all propositions. But if you combine Al Maqūlāt's discussion with the syllogism's discussions, you get a disturbing picture. The picture is that, well, if you combine syllogism's discussions with Al Maqūlāt distinction, while syllogism has some passages which implies that all propositions must be negative propositions, namely propositions that do not have existential import, and the syllogisms also has some discussions that must be taken to imply that all propositions must be taken to be affirmative, namely propositions with existential import. And so, in fact, if you combine these two passages of syllogism, then you can see that the doctrine in Al-Farabi's existential import doctrine in Al Maqūlāt is contradicting the thesis in syllogism. Also, if we go to contraposition, well, as I said, A contraposition is the thesis that every A is B is logically equivalent with every non-A is non-B. Well, this is a thesis that Aristotle accepted in his topics, and Al-Farabi followed Aristotle to accept A contraposition. But actually, A contraposition thesis conflicts with not only Al-Farabi's modest version of the affirmative negative doctrine, but also the affirmative negative doctrine per se. And for this reason, a later proponent of the affirmative negative doctrine, namely Buridan, came to reject the A contraposition thesis. So Al-Farabi, and so these are the issues left beyond the Al Maqūlāt. And so let me end by a summary. The summary is Al-Farabi has an historical importance in the development of the traditional doctrine of existential, the traditional logic, and the development of logic in general, because he is arguably the first logician who gave a systematic discussion of the existential import of categorical propositions. And in his discussion of the existential import, he holds a version of the affirmative negative doctrine, namely in Al Maqūlāt. And the version of the affirmative negative doctrine, which I call Al-Farabi's doctrine, is a common core of two medieval doctrines of existential import, namely Abélard's and Ockham's, which are competitors. But as I mentioned, both Al-Farabi's doctrine in particular, and then the affirmative negative doctrine in general, conflicts with some thesis of Aristotle's logic, such as the contraposition thesis. And I think this suggests problems in attributing the affirmative negative doctrine to Aristotle himself, and which means that Al-Farabi is arguably, or as far as I know, the first philosopher who has given a version of the affirmative negative doctrine, which was influential through the medieval time. Okay, so that's all. And before I end it by thanking the audience, let me acknowledge the help I got from Wilfred Hodges and Salua Chetty, and two of my research assistants, Matthew Ramakel and Yasmin El-Jabari. And then let me note that the presentation file that I have used for this talk is stored in my academia edu site. And then let me end this by thanking you, and thank you for listening. Bye.